Hello. I wanted to tell you that I pretend not to be Wes Callahan. I don't think I will ever be somebody like that. But I do wanted I I wanted to make this video so that it is something that you can watch and take notes as I'm going to be reading a little bit today, which is not something that's really comfortable to do in front of people. But the book that I have here is fabulous. I have a goal one day to read the whole thing. It's called From Dawn to Decadence, from one of my very favorite historians, Jacques, Jacques Barzun. And he's from, I believe, England, and died maybe 15 years ago. So he's lived in our modern century. One of the best histories I have heard is this one, From Dawn to Decadence, and it tells the last 500 years of history. And anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about Oliver Cromwell. And I wanted you to keep in mind that, first of all, the story of Oliver Cromwell is quite controversial. As a military leader, he was known as one of the best. Many people in England still believe that he was a great man to have relieved the country of England from a tyrannical king, Charles I, who decided to live without or rule without Parliament for 11 years. He didn't want them to make any decisions, so he took away their power and he ruled himself. And some of the people had asked Cromwell to to go serve in Parliament to represent them. And it was during this civil war, let's say, between the king and his people and Parliament and its people. And there was a great civil war. And without Cromwell, Parliament would not have won that war. On the other hand, there are many that believe that Cromwell was a traitor, that he was a king killer, because Parliament did serve papers to the king asking for his execution because he was tyrannical. He took away the Parliament's power, and Cromwell was right there, as one of the signers. And so if you ask an English person who really knows their history, there's going to be some controversial feelings there between who Cromwell was and what he did. And you get to choose what you see, how you see Cromwell, whether he was a traitor or he was kind of this idea of a Republican leader that put back the power in Parliament. When he ruled for 9 years, and his sort of rule was kind of a Republican rule. He was not a king. He was called a Lord Protector. And of course, when he died, his son Richard came into power and miserably failed. He didn't have what it took to lead. And some of the people in England call him, let me see if I can see where it is. They call him Tumble Down Dick. So his name was on all the pubs at the time, and he was made fun of. And this made it very easy for the Stuarts to come back in and put their Charles II on the throne. So anyway, I'm going to read a couple of pages from Dawn to Decadence, and I hope that you will take notes. I want you to know that there's a word in here that's called clemency. And when I read it, what it just means is that this clemency is that you're more lenient, you're more tolerable to people. You show mercy, okay? And another thing I want you to know is that Parliament was a bicameral house. There's a higher house, which is a House of Lords. These are the people who own land. And then there's a lower house, and that's the House of Commons. And those are the common people. Most of them are not landowners, but they are still people who make up most of England and need to be represented. So the Parliament is the supreme legislative body of UK. At the time, it was of just England. And I want you to notice three things. As I'm reading, notice how Jacques Barzun compares Cromwell's life to Caesar's life. Now, I'm not talking about the Caesar in Shakespeare, but the actual Caesar himself, the history of Caesar. And also, I will read about something that is a clear mark of a statesman. And I want you to look for that. And then also look for some things that Charles I did to put his rule in jeopardy. Okay, here we go. Oliver Cromwell's life and mind put one in mind of Julius Caesar. Not Shakespeare's Caesar, the bugbear of Republicans. Bugbear is actually an English word for pet peeve. So not the pet peeve of Republicans, but the man who in middle life turned himself into a soldier with outstanding success and used his military authority to guide his countrymen's return to a settled state. Each of the pair was offered a crown, which was refused, while the people they led also refused to agree among themselves and make their own innovations work. Only the leader's armed power and skill maintained any social peace. With his death, Caesar's by assassination, Cromwell's from natural causes, the new and improved order ended in confusion. The essential likeness between these two soldier statesmen may be seen in a trait that is often noted with surprise: their clemency. But this readiness to welcome and make use of former enemies is the clearest mark of the statesman. He understands that what he has to govern is the whole country, not just his own party and good friends. The mere politician, however, talks about the public good, but acts only for a portion of it. Given the kaleidoscope of religious and political aims of the Puritans and the hatred aroused in the Royalists and the Anglicans by the rebels' radicalism, anybody willing and able to rule England needed uncommon talents. They germed and blossomed in Cromwell. A country gentleman of modest means, he had no ambition of greatness. By chance, his early teacher was a Puritan, and at Cambridge his college was known for its Puritan leanings. Young Cromwell did not distinguish himself academically, but it is said that he was good at mathematics and a keen reader of history. Raleigh's History of the World was his favorite book. These two studies he urged on his son Richard, because they fit for public service as for which a man is born. If Richard took the advice, it did not help him when he succeeded his father. He fell from power and is best known for his subsequent fame on pub signs as Tumbledown Dick. Cromwell made a happy marriage with Elizabeth Boucher. She wrote to him, "My life is but half a life in your absence. And he wrote to her, "Thou art dearer to me than any creature." His occupation for a dozen years was farming, the land that he had inherited. Though capably done, it yielded but a small income. Nonetheless, his neighbors sent him to represent them in Parliament at the very time when it began to quarrel with the king over ship money, a tax not authorized by law, and other abuses of royal power. Though Charles granted a petition of right that let go some of his powers, he went on to rule without a parliament for 11 years, nullifying the rights. Little is known about Cromwell's life during that decade. Presumably, it was around of farming until he sold his fields and rented some grazing land nearby. Now remember that John Milton was one of Cromwell's very closest friends, and that John Milton worked with Oliver Cromwell in the battles and in the fight to put down the king. The 30 Years' War was then in its Swedish period, and Cromwell, anxious like others after its bearing on Protestantism in Europe, apparently read accounts of Gustavus Adolphus' military methods, for his own later command of troops was based on them. But before war was thought of, he showed his resistance to royal authority in small ways. He refused the ritual of knighthood and was fined £10. He stood up against his fellow local officials when they tried to infringe the rights of the poor users of the common land. Cromwell was jailed, released after trial, and then reconciled with a major who had impugned him. At this point, Jacques is gonna talk about how Oliver Cromwell at this time felt a desire to move to the New World with other Puritans, and he eventually did not do that, but he did suffer some of the same pains that the Puritans suffered, feeling that they were the chiefest of all sinners, and he fell into some depression because of this. And you will read more about this type of feeling as you continue on throughout your life, discussing Puritan thought. And I'm going to skip some of these things, but there are 3 quotes that I wanted to include that show some of Cromwell's clemency and some of his good nature. And this is a quote to his cousin, Mrs. St. John. In 1638, he writes, "Oh, I lived and loved darkness and hated light. I hated godliness, yet God had mercy on me." This was in some of his time of depression, but he recognized God's hand. Here's another one. This is in 1643, about 5 years later. He's writing to a Major General, Crawford, and he said, "Sir, the state, in choosing men to serve it, takes no notice of their opinions. If they be willing to serve it, that satisfies. I advise you formally to bear with minds of different men from yourself. Take heed of being sharp against those to whom you can object little, but that they square not with you in matters of religion." Do you see the tolerance that he has? And he's teaching his major generals to have this tolerance. And to surround himself with people that don't have the same opinion. Very good example of statesmanship. Here's another one. This is Cromwell writing after the religious war in Scotland. He says, "I desire from my heart, I have prayed for, I have waited for the day to see union and right understanding between the godly people, Scots, English, Jews, Gentiles, Presbyterians, Anabaptists, and all. You can see that was one of his major purposes in living and in fighting the wars. He wanted to see this unity. This is another example of a great statesman. It says over here that under his rule, this is when he's ruling, and he focused a lot on trade, opening the trade routes and protecting the trade routes, and it brought great progress and what's the word I'm trying to find? Brain fog from being sick, I think. Prosperity. It brought great prosperity to England while he was ruling. And it said, under his rule, the Catholics and the Anglicans were somewhat better off than before. He had wanted to pardon a Catholic priest who in 1654 was put to death for his zeal. The verdict on Cromwell himself is that he was not the cruel, tyrannical ruler, nor the narrow-gauge Puritan of legend. And continues, his policies made England prosperous. By navigation acts, he increased trade in English ships. He favored the colonies and furthered colonization. He may be called the founder of the British Empire. These actions brought on a trade war with the Dutch in which their fleets, though aptly led, were defeated by the naval hero of age, Robert Blake. In the Elizabethan tradition, Spain's treasure cargo was seized off Cadiz, and for safe shipping, the Mediterranean pirates were got rid of. So, he later contracted malaria in Ireland, and he died of it at age 59. And then, like I said, his son came into power, but he quickly lost it, and the whole state of England was left in confusion. And then it made for a wonderful time for the Stuart kings to come back in and take over England. So with that, I have some questions right down there below the video. And if you will answer those questions and then look up in some of your encyclopedias and read a little bit more about Oliver Cromwell. He's important to know.